Hi everyone, welcome to week 9. Today we're going to look at assessment. It's something we look at a lot in this unit when we are talking in the tutorials or these recordings of tutorials. It's really key that we understand how important assessment is in our planning and also in our teaching, every single lesson. Now, many of you have got your head around, have a pretty good understanding of these aspects, but there's always still at this stage a number of students who still require development in this area. And even if you think you have got your head around it, you can always develop your skills and your knowledge further. Part of being a teacher, constant professional development, and something you'll do your whole career. So this, in this recording though, rather than just talking through what these different types of assessment are, which I'll cover very briefly at the beginning because I know we've already looked at it this session, I'm actually going to give you examples of exactly what you can write in your lesson plans to demonstrate these. Okay, so a quick overview. This comes from NESA, the link's at the bottom, but you'll be able to search them as well. So assessment for learning, we know that it involves teachers using evidence about students' knowledge, and we know that that's to inform our teaching, and that's every single lesson. That's a formative assessment task as part of your orientation that then informs your teaching for the rest of the lesson. Can we move forward as I planned? Do we need to review anything? Do we need to explore the student's background knowledge further? That type of thing. And at each stage of the lesson, you're checking in or monitoring the students to assess them formatively to make sure they're learning what you think they are learning. And this can also happen at the end of the lesson. So that very last activity you do at the end of the lesson, a sticky note activity, some form of reflection where they you are able to make a judgment on what they've learned that lesson, that's still formative assessment for learning, because then it then informs your planning and teaching for the subsequent lesson. So if we then move on to assessment as learning, this is when students are their own assessors. And I'll give you some examples of this as well during this recording. The teacher does not assess the students. So if you're including assessment as learning in a lesson plan, the students are assessing themselves or each other. And finally, assessment of learning. Keeping in mind, this is when you're assessing students against achievement standards. Assessment of learning doesn't happen at the end of a lesson or the end of every single lesson. Assessment of learning, or summative assessment, happens at the end of a unit, the end of the year. It can be internal assessment, so school-based assessment, or external assessment, so actual external exams that students have to sit. So assessment for learning, so it happens constantly, as we've already said, at every stage of the lesson, and it's how you as the teacher in the classroom understand if the students are making progress or not, what they're up to, what they're learning, what they didn't quite get. There's some really helpful videos from QCAA. The links are at the bottom of the page, and I strongly advise that you watch them. If you can't click on the links in the PDF of these PowerPoints, which is available in the unit content, then you can do a Google search QCAA and you can see the title there, Implementing Teaching, Learning and Assessment. And you can see the top of a video there in that little screen grab, but there's lots of links to videos underneath that are really helpful for understanding assessment for learning, or as they say in Queensland, formative assessment. So let's look at some examples of assessment for learning or formative assessment in lesson plans. And I do use both of those phrases when I talk to you about it, assessment for learning and formative assessment. The reason for that is that assessment for learning is the term that you'll come across if you're going to be teaching in New South Wales, and formative assessment is what's used in Queensland schools. That being said, you might hear either of these terms used in your schools because it depends on the individual school, the sector that you're working in, the background of the teachers that you're working with, that type of thing. All right, so let's see what it looks like in your actual lesson plans. So the lesson plans that you're using in this unit, they have a column for assessment. These are examples of assessment for learning that could go in that column. So some people aren't quite sure exactly what to write. Sometimes students just include the questions that they would ask or the questions that they're trying to have answered. What you really need is how you're going to find the answers to those questions. So it's fine to include a question like, have the students understood this aspect of poetry, that type of thing. But what you really want is this very specific strategy that you are going to use to formatively assess the students at each stage of the lesson. So if we look on the screen, there's a big variety here. So we've got the idea of think, pair, share, observing students, reading through students' responses to inform the next lesson, monitoring students as they work, the idea that reteaching may be required. So it's good to acknowledge that. One strategy that includes reteaching is the idea of gradual release. So you'll teach something and perhaps you'll model it. So you'll do that think aloud of showing students how to do the task, for write a sentence, start a mind map. You then draw them into it, so you start co-creating, and then finally you let them do it by themselves. At that point, you can say, if you feel confident with this, please go and sit down. You can begin work by yourself in pairs and groups. If you're not sure or you still have questions, move to the front and we can continue to work on it, or we can go through it again. So that's the idea of gradual release. Not everyone in the class will need to go through it again, but some students may need to hear it with different language, with different examples. For those of you who are doing the primary secondary degree, that kind of aligns with the idea of I do, we do, you do. And the you do is the point where you can do that gradual release. So students who are capable can go off and begin working independently or in groups. Students who aren't ready for that yet can remain with the teacher and keep working. So think about how you can support your students as you move through and how formative assessment, this assessment for learning, informs those choices. So press pause here if you want to read through these. These are really good examples, and they're really what I'm going to be expecting to see in your lesson plans, and a variety of them. So if you just say observe students working, observe students working, observe students working, that's all I see that you're doing the whole lesson, I would start to question, how well do you really know what students are doing? Some students, especially when we're talking about senior students, are really good at pretending to work. They know exactly what to do. They've got a pen in their hand, they've got their book open, but they're not listening and they're not engaging. The only way that you can work that out is, for example, using a think, pair, share. They've got to talk to someone next to them, you directly questioning them, collecting their work to look at it, that type of thing, and all of these other examples on the board. So you really need to have a variety of strategies to assess your students formatively every lesson. As I said, press pause if you'd like a bit more time to read through these. There's really a great variety here. And this is what I'd see in your assessment column in your lesson plans. So assessment as learning. We've got two aspects here. So assessment as learning includes student self-assessment. So they assess themselves, plan for their own self-improvement, maybe mark themselves against the criteria that you've provided, or using a rubric for a future assessment. You are not assessing them. They are assessing themselves. Students need a lot of support to be able to do this. So even if you do have a senior class, don't make assumptions about their ability to be able to effectively self-assess. You really need to scaffold and support students over time to have the skills to be able to do this well. And you would do that through modelling, through practice, consistently. If you're lucky enough to have students for some consecutive years, you can really develop their skills right from grade 7 up through to grade 12. And that's really beneficial when you walk into your grade 11 or grade 12 class and you think, right, all of these students know exactly where we're coming from. I know what skills they have and don't have. Let's go. Obviously, that's years down the track, but it's something to look forward to. Another aspect of assessment as learning is peer assessment. Once again, students are assessing each other, they're making judgments, they need some kind of criteria or rubric or points that they're specifically looking at, and they provide each other with feedback. Once again, the teacher is not assessing the students. And once again, students need a lot of support to be able to get to this stage where they can confidently provide feedback and make judgments about a peer's piece of work. That can be really intimidating for some students, and you can imagine the type of scaffolding and support that would have to be in place over time to get there. You can't just walk into a room, say, we're doing peer assessment, here's a rubric, now sit down, read out each other's work and tell them what's wrong. That's terrifying, and they won't do it effectively. So they need to fully understand what's required. You would have spent a lesson or two going through the rubric and talking about outcomes, examples of what each thing means, maybe looking at different exemplars of work. What does an A look like? What does a C look like? What does an E look like? That type of thing. They've got a really good understanding of what this rubric or criteria is and what it looks like, as well as you developing their skills to be able to have these conversations. So what does self or peer assessment look like in lesson plans? Here's some examples. I'll let you read through them. So press pause if you'd like some more time to look through them, but you can see the idea of working with peers or also individually to assess. So what about assessment of learning or summative assessment? When we're talking about our senior students, we're talking about internal and external assessments. School-based assessments, depending on which state you're in, and the external exams. If you're teaching year 11 and year 12, you'll probably be mentioning the exams and final assessments every week, if not every lesson. You need to have a really good understanding of what the students will be doing. You can look at past papers, you can talk to colleagues, you can get criteria, examples as well. You can get examples of previous students' work, generally that's been graded, to really inform what you're doing. But you need to have a very clear idea of the end goal to get your students there. With that in mind, that's why I will not see assessment of learning or summative assessment in your lesson plans, because it doesn't happen in your lesson, especially in senior classrooms. It happens in the hall. There might be a school-based assessment that takes place in class, but that's not going to be in any lesson plan I see. It breaks down the internal assessments and the external assessments. The differences are, you'll see that, and I'll show you an example of a summative assessment task in a minute. But the internal assessments, students receive very, very detailed assessments in advance. So they'll include the title of the task, an outline of the task, the outcomes or objectives of the task, what's going to be met, due dates, and obviously a rubric. And that rubric you will use as a teaching tool, as we've already said, in other activities, and they may be in those assessment as learning tasks in the weeks that lead up to that assessment. The external assessment, students are going down and sitting in an exam in the hall that's all set up single desks, absolute silence with invigilators, and exam conditions. And again, that's something that you will be practicing in the classroom. You'll be doing practice exams in the class. It's all part of the process of learning how all of those procedures are conducted, specifically for the state you're in, specifically for the school you're in. Ask lots of questions is my advice on that one. So assessment of learning. This is an example of an external exam. This comes from the New South Wales syllabus. You can see there's a link on the right-hand side of the page. This is annotated, so in blue you can see the exact extra instructions provided. These are two separate ones, so you can see section 1 and section 2. The one on the left is for module A, textual conversations. The one on the right is for module B, close study of literature. You can see how many marks it's worth, how many questions students should attempt, how much time they have for each section, and more instructions. So these are the types of papers that you will be familiar with or should be familiar with before you start teaching your senior class. And as I said, you can access past papers and normally samples, answers of past papers, and also samples of students' work as well where relevant on the site. So QCAA if you're in Queensland, or on the NESA website as well. So lots of information and examples of assessment in class and those final external assessments that our seniors go through. We'll talk more about it in the drop-in session if you'd like to. You can do some of your own research. There's lots of information on those syllabus web pages from QCA and NESA as well. Hopefully you're still developing your ICT skills and knowledge of all sorts of different resources. Another thing that we can have a chat about in the drop-in sessions. Here's just a few that you might want to consider. Newsella is one through Google. Now Comment is this idea of involving students in discussions online. And there's other ones as well. These are just a sample. Especially if you're in a school with a BYOD policy, bring your own device, where all students do have a laptop or a tablet. Really finding these rich opportunities for them to engage beyond just Google Classroom or OneNote or whatever the standard one is. Just keep in mind, if you're in schools in Queensland, they have exceptionally strict policy and guidance around software that can be used in schools. So just always check with your mentor teacher, or when you do have a permanent position, always check with another teacher if you are allowed to use certain software or programs in school. That bottom one, StickPick, it's just an online version of basically having paddle pops in a cup, so that, you know, paddle pop sticks with each one has a student's name written on it, and you pull them out to ask questions. It just makes sure that you spread your questioning around the room. You can just as easily have names written on a piece of paper that you pull out of a hat. There's name generators. I can't think of an actual name, but I think a name of a website, but I'm pretty sure if you put name generator into Google, you'll find something. The idea is you just put all the first names of your students in it, click it, and it spins around and throws up a name, and that's the student that has to answer the next question. There's lots of opportunities just to make lessons a little bit different, a little bit less dry, which can happen. Okay, so next week we'll talk about, we'll look at an exemplar from assessment 2. So we'll be talking about academic writing at the level that I expect to see it, and we'll continue drop-in sessions so you can ask questions about the assessment as well. I hope seeing some examples this week really clarified some ideas for you. And I'll see you in the drop-in sessions where we can talk about it more. Have a great week.